Hi, good morning, and thank you so much for taking the time out to join us for this first of 3 webinars we're running during November with the theme of the business of charity. To start a dialogue that might help us to understand and fill the gap that exists between the reasons charities and the business sector. Just by way of a quick bit of housekeeping, please post any questions that you have for the panel during the conversation into the Ask a Question panel, and I will do my best to feed those into the discussion as we go along. We'll be recording the session today, so if you prefer not to use your name when we read out your question, then please say so when you pose the question, and we'll just do that anonymously. So I'm Jane Graham, your host today, and as the Commercial Director of Citizens Advice Gateshead and Director of our Social Enterprise Society Matters Community Interest Company, I joined the charity about 3.5 years ago after spending about 30 years working in the private business sector. And during that time, my interest in the charity and social enterprise sectors steadily grew. And I often witnessed the divide, or at least the disconnect between what's commonly classed as the third sector and the private or for-profit sector businesses. What made the biggest impression on me over those decades were the suggestions that the charitable sector needed to be more business-like. And that fueled my determination to join the sector a few years ago, but is also very much the backdrop for the mobilisation of these webinars today. Because although obviously the charitable sector has come much more into view recently, particularly as a result of the pandemic, what's absolutely clear to me is that a charity is very much a business, and a business that faces the tricky challenge of the order book being continually full, but sadly its customers are unable to pay. And whilst the P&L account can be a good indicator of the success of a business, charities' profit and loss statements don't show profit. So that brings me to the focus of the business of charity webinars. Our next 2 webinars will pick up on the theme of the economics of social value and look at how business and charities can work together for mutual societal gain. But today we're going to talk about that order book and understand why it always seems to be full. So it's with great pleasure that I introduce our panel to you. Barry Taylor, the Chair of Trustees of Citizens Advice Gateshead, Miriam Harte, who's recently joined us as Patron, Professor Greta Defeyter, Director of the Healthy Living Lab at Northumbria University, and Alison Dunn, who is the Chief Executive of Citizens Advice Gateshead, my boss, and the person responsible for leading the business of Citizens Advice Gateshead for almost 10 years. So first, Alison, welcome to today's discussion. I think we should start probably with understanding a little about the business of the charity Citizens Advice Gateshead.
Hi Jane, and welcome everybody to this webinar. As Jane's explained, this is the first of 3 conversations for us that we're very much looking forward to having with you. So Citizens Advice Gateshead is part of a federated structure. That means that we are a member of National Citizens Advice. There are about 300 independent local citizens advisors in our network, and that's really important because we are local, we're independent charities, and as such we're independent legal entities, and we have to stand on our own 2 feet. And many people don't understand that about the Citizens Advice brand, because it appears to be a national organisation, and in fact there is a national organisation, but we are separate from it. We're branded as Citizens Advice and we support our local community. We're a local charity, we're funded independently, and everything that we earn we have to competitively tender for, or we have to apply for grants. So Citizens Advice Gateshead was first shown in records in about the 40s, but we were established as an organisation in 1957. And as Jane said, I took over leadership of this organisation about 10 years ago. At that time, we had a workforce of about 35 people, and we had a turnover of about £850,000. In the 10 years of my tenure, we've grown that workforce from 35 to almost 200 staff members, and we have a turnover of over £4 million now. But really, one of the questions which is on my mind as we have this conversation is growth our only option in terms of serving the community and the business of charity? So I'd like to, start thinking about that. But we are a business as well as a charity. We have to operate like a business. We have to operate at a surplus to be able to do the things that are important to us. And the things that are important to us are, and Barry has very helpfully got our vision behind him, we absolutely believe in the concept of a fair society for all with lives well lived. What we do is advice, information and guidance. And for those that don't know what that is, it's social welfare advice. So it's things like housing, employment, welfare benefits, money advice, to name but a few. So that's a whistle-stop tour of who we are and how we've got to where we are and why we're starting these conversations. Thanks, Jane.
Thank you, Alison. So, Greta, thank you for joining us today. Could you just explain a little about yourself and the Healthy Living Lab as a starting point, and where you think that fits into the discussion today about why the order book of the is full?
Sure. Okay. Good morning, everybody. My name is Professor Greta Defeyter, and I'm Director of the Healthy Living Lab at Northumbria University. I formed the lab about 15 years ago, following some research we were looking at in schools on food insecurity or food poverty in children. And at that time, our work focused mainly on researching the effects of school attendance from children from underserved communities, and the role that food played in their educational attainment and also in their cognitive and physical development. And I'd love to say it that my research lab was formed based on years and years of study of theoretical papers, but that would be not true. The lab was actually formed following a visit to a Greg-sponsored child breakfast club in Byker. And I was at that club researching the effect of breakfast on children's cognition. So lovely, from a researcher's point of view, lovely controlled experiment with different conditions, different cereals that we were giving the children, weighing out exactly the amount of semi-skim milk children were getting. And whilst we were there looking at the effect of breakfast on sustained attention, recall, etc., I actually saw a little boy stuffing toast into his pockets at the breakfast clubs. And foolishly, I said to the head teacher, "What's he doing?" And she looked at me like I was completely insane and said, "Well, he's taking the toast home to have later, because when he gets home, he won't have anything to eat." And it just astounded me that in UK, about 10 years ago, we had a situation where a child was putting toast into his pockets in his backpack to enable him to eat in the evening. And it astounded me to such a level that I then decided to basically develop a lab and start my lab that was going to research food poverty, food insecurity, and poverty more generally across the UK. And since then, we have been busy looking primarily around food insecurity. So we were the first lab to publish on what was called then holiday hunger. And I worked with the DfE at shaping holiday provision and food activities bill and the subsequent funding that has then come down from that. We work on looking at effective ways of introducing healthy start vouchers. And more generally, we look at the effect of food and look at systems analysis of how charities, businesses and governments all work together to try and address some of the structural causes of poverty and subsequently food insecurity. Thank you, Jay.
Fantastic. Thank you very much indeed for being with us today, Greta. So I'll now move on to introducing Miriam. So I had a look at the 15,000 Gateshead residents that Citizens Advice Gateshead had supported over the past 18 months in terms of the data that we've collected. And there's a stark message in there, Miriam, that 60% of those people that we've supported, clients of Citizens Advice Gateshead, said that they were suffering from a long-term health condition associated with both physical and mental health. So Miriam, as someone who has a long history of leadership roles in the charity sector, but has also had much involvement with the NHS and health sector, where do you see health sitting with this agenda?
Well, I think if you think about all the services you provide, usually what you'll find is people don't have one issue. They will have a combination or some combination of the several areas that you provide advice in, like health, housing, employment, poverty. I guess poverty is the biggest single contributor to poor health. I mean, if you know, I guess my interest in health and in mental health in particular is in addressing inequalities, because people who have a mental health condition, and many who have chronic physical health conditions, are more likely to have issues with housing, are more likely to have issues with employment, are more likely to be drawing benefits, have issues with debt. So it's a very unhappy circle. And when you think about the government and, you know, institutions like the NHS, local authorities, and the charitable sector, we all have the best of intentions about supporting people to live better lives, but often it's very hard for the individual to navigate the spider's web of what's out there to support them. And that's where organizations like Citizens Advice provide some of the route maps. But I also think in looking at all of that, you know, there must be a better way of everybody working together to do the things they're best at. You know, in particular, if you think about mental health, a lot of the support and care that is provided by charities that are much better placed on a community basis to provide the kind of support that people need. And in particular, you know, the kind of day-to-day support like running you know, clubs and engagement and activities and things like that, whereas the NHS needs to focus on the more acute end of need, in particular in mental health. So there's often people better at doing things than, you know, the large monolith that is the NHS. And I think one of the other things that's become clear in the pandemic is, you know, the NHS can't do everything. It's, you know, the need is exponential, and, you know, there'll have to be a discussion about how we manage to provide the right kind of support and what's it called, the safety nets for people around our society. And that's one of the reasons I'm particularly interested in how we can work with charitable organizations and with business and with the community as a whole, because it's all linked. You know, people are supported, they will get jobs, they will live good lives, etc. So it's ensuring people have the opportunity, no matter what the disadvantages that have landed on them, that they can actually get support and move forward.
Thanks, Miriam. And I think some of the points that you've made are bound to pick up again during the course of this discussion. So thank you for that. So finally, in introducing our panel, I'll be handing over to you, Barry. Barry, a former director of the Probation Service, who has worked in that field for over 30 years, before we were privileged to have you join the charity as a trustee and then chair a few years ago following your retirement. What does charity mean to you, Barry? And what do you think why do you think, charity is so often cast to be about the charity sector rather than necessarily the work that needs to be done?
Well, yes, thanks, Jane. Morning, everybody. Well, I think reflecting on my journey in relation to charity as a public sector employee and an organisation, probation service, that engaged widely with the charity sector, I think one of the things that I grew to understand over time was just the importance of how independent organisations can more often respond more creatively and innovative ways for helping people with their issues. I think back about the probation service, I mean, we were very good at a lot of things, but not very good at doing everything. And it took us quite a while to work that out. But once we did, it was appreciated and realised that focusing on our core business and actually engaging with others who could support the people who we were trying to help with the wider range of issues that they were grappling with, which were directly impacting on their vulnerability and their propensity. Was a bit of a light bulb moment, really. But I do think across the wider community, there is still quite a challenge for us all in helping people to understand just where charity fits in. And I think people's perception and understanding of the role of charities is not very much directed by their own personal sort of involvement or exposure to it. So, if somebody's actually giving their time voluntarily to a particular organisation, quite clearly their awareness has been raised around specific issues. If you're working for an organisation that's engaged with charities, then equally, that awareness increases. There are large sectors, I think, where the role of charities is clearly not well understood, and one of the things we will be exploring in these sessions moving forward is the relationship between ourselves and business. And I think it's an interesting conversation we're going to have.
Thanks, Barry. So now turning to the core theme of this webinar, why the order book is always full. So if I may, I'd like to start with yourself, Greta. Why do you think the order book is always full?
Okay, so I think when we look at this issue, and I think everyone on this webinar will agree it's a serious issue, we have to really go back and look at the structural causes of why we think the order book is full. Because if we're always just looking at to coin a phrase, mopping up the consequences, the order book will always be full. And so I think that when we look at the rise of neoliberalism in the UK or in the US, what you can see is actually after the implementation of such an approach, that inequalities in terms of wages, in terms of health, always goes up, it always increases. And I think what's happened over the last few years is that having this type of approach where you have a value on individual entrepreneurial freedoms and skills within a free trade market often results in terms of the charity sector and people that actually can't engage in that of inequalities and rise of inequalities. Let me give you an example. Okay, so I'm quite old in the tooth. From when I was young, school food, with all of its implications around free school meal tickets and being in a queue for free school meals or not, anyone about my age will remember that. The meals were always provided at school by school cooks within the local education authority. With privatisation of that market, what's actually happened is that rather than it become a race for quality, it's actually driven the price down for a race of the cheapest provider for the contract. And the end result of that is actually it's the young people or children that are in receipt of those meals that often suffer that. It's not to say that there aren't good meals out there. It's the market forces that can drive this type of thing. And so taking an entrepreneurship approach, it's great if you can do that and access the market, right? The trouble is now is that charities, and often this, I think probably the watershed moment was David Cameron's notion of the big society. Charities now are really involved at propping up and trying to enable people to access that market. And so I find it really interesting from an academic's perspective is to look at the different system actors in terms of the role of the state, the role of charities, and the role of business and how they interplay. And that's not saying that we shouldn't be looking at all of them, but I think that most people that work in charities, especially across the North East, will say their order book is always full and is increasingly full because that state provision, that advice around benefits, the advice and support around mental health is not actually now included within the state system.
That's really interesting. Thank you, Greta. So before we move on to Alison, your response to that, and your thoughts on this issue, we do have some audience participation in the form of a short poll. So I think that should actually come in front of you right now. So we'd like to know, for the people who are involved in the audience now, what balance of responsibility should there be between the state and the charity sector? Should it be 30-70 charity state, 70-30 charity state, or should it be 50-50? Okay. I'll just give you another minute for everybody to finish voting. We're almost there. Okay, so that's great. Thank you very much. The results from the audience, 30-70 balance to the state, 50-50, 32%, charity state, 47%, and the lowest percentage would be 70% charity, 30% state. So about half of you think it should be 30% charity, 70% state. Greta, did you want to comment on that before we move on to Alison?
I would totally agree with all of the audience and say that looks about the right distribution to me. I think you have to think about it in terms of social justice and equality and what the role of government should be. Well, if the role of government is not to support the well-being and welfare of its citizens, I really don't know what it is. And so that's not to actually override the charity sector. I think they have a vital role, and often that local community response, as many as my fellow members on the panel have already said, that communities and charities do it far better than big state or top-down approaches. But I think we have to look at it in terms of, even if the state aren't doing it, I would be challenging the state of saying, how are you supporting charities to do the work? Charities should not be actually meeting the work demand that's not covered by the state, and then the charity having to apply for funding to do the work that, in my opinion, the state should be doing. So if we go for a 70-30 split, which I think is very good, I think it's a good proportion, then my request to the government would be to say, well, actually directly pay charities and community organisations for doing that work. Why are charities spending a lot of time bidding competitively against each other? There's a much far better way of co-designing a system to work far more effectively for both the advantage of government, the charity sector, businesses, and most importantly, individuals within our society and communities.
Thanks, Greta. That's really interesting. In fact,
could I just add something there?
Yeah.
This thought has been in my mind since we started some of these discussions. You know, the old idea of philanthropy and charitable donations from, you know, the great givers and the great donors that we all know and have had the great opportunity to work with. You know, the idea of that was to enhance people's lives, not to provide the basics. And what you'll find now, if you analyse especially I would say over the period of austerity and since the banking crisis, is the philanthropic donations are now focused on a lot of them paying for the basics and not enhancing people's lives in all the ways that they would have originally set out to do. So maybe it's an old-fashioned view of philanthropy, but you know that was the aspiration of the great givers and the great donors. You know, from you know Victorian times, if you like.
Really interesting point, and there's lots of nodding in the panel, so there's obviously agreement with that point. I think before we hand over to Alison, I think my comment would be aligned with that is the experience we've had with food banks, where they were crisis support and then they became part of the established system, so that reflects that point. We have had a point from a member of our audience, Pat Richardson, who's mentioned that if we're asking that question, what are we actually talking about in terms of responsibility? Is it about ensuring the reduction of poverty? And I think that's that is the context that we are talking in, although clearly there is that broader context in terms of enhancing people's lives. We are talking about the reduction of poverty. Thanks for that, Pat. So Alison, what's your view on this? Why is the order book always full?
Yeah, so picking up the point about the context in which we're discussing today, it is absolutely about the alleviation of poverty, but it's also about the reduction of inequality, of which we have a staggering amount of inequality in this country, considering we're one of the most, the richest and most evolved governments in the Western Hemisphere. So the reduction of inequality is also really important to us, and that's why we have focused our vision on a fair society for all with lives well lived. Inequalities have grown significantly during COVID. It's worse than ever before. We have, you know, as many as 65% of children who are living in poverty come from a household where there is at least one person in full-time employment. How can that be? But going back to the challenge that the poll rather that we just ran there about the difference between the responsibilities of state and charity, I won't lie, I did try to vote even though it said not to. The poll came out at 7:30. I absolutely think that that is where it should be. And Greta's point about, regardless of where that split is for national government, to set the framework within which charities should be operating, recognising the very important role that we have to play. We have perhaps, you know, during COVID shown our capability in ways that have never before been understood. We are absolutely a trusted sector for government to invest in, but they have to provide the right conditions for us to operate in. So Greta made a point about voluntary sector organisations having to compete against each other, and that's absolutely true. And if we think about our own organisation, you know, we are funded from up to 30 different sources. So, you know, we have a very, you know, medium-sized organisation here with 200 employees, aspirations to support 100 volunteers, but actually maintaining that diversity of funding takes up a huge amount of the charity's resource. The other thing which concerns me for the charitable sector is this propensity between philanthropy, commissioners, trusts and foundations that put us in this rat race of constantly having to reinvent ourselves when actually we know that what we do makes a difference. Advice, information and guidance, speaking specifically about citizens' advice, is something which is absolutely a fundamental. For other charities as well, the work that they do is proven. Having to reinvent themselves all of the time, every time a funding round comes around, is exhausting and actually a waste of resource. But in terms of the government's responsibility specifically for advice, information and guidance, again, the point that Greta made about the, you know, the disestablishment of legal aid and the removal of free legal advice for social issues like housing, employment, welfare benefits, money advice. This is a fundamental removal of the rights of our citizens to be able to access things which are really important, things which are their right. Welfare benefits and access to DWP is not a handout, it is a right which is enshrined in law. And when we've disestablished legal aid and the right to free representation in order to challenge those decisions, we are undermining what is a fundamental right. And for that reason, the charities order book is overflowing. It's absolutely overflowing. So I conducted a strategic review of advice, information and guidance in Gateshead a year or two back. And what that tells us is that 40%, only 40% of our citizens actually access the advice, information and guidance that they need. If 100% of those people were to come forward, we would be absolutely overrun. And that's the same across the charitable sector. It's not just for citizens advice, Gateshead. And that research that I conducted was also underpinned by similar findings from the Money Advice Service. So, you know, it's robust. Only 40% of people are actually in the system who need the advice and help that the charitable sector has available to it. I'll pause there. I could go on.
Thank you, Alison. Thank you. And Barry, do you have any thoughts in terms of the what Alison and Greta and Miriam have said about big society, or about the point that Alison's just been making, and the need for people to keep reinventing to be able to access the money they need for the problems that are the same as they ever have been, and getting worse?
I think for me, one of the key issues is back to this point I think Greta was making about co-design of services at the very beginning of the process. You would imagine in this day and age, with the plethora of information that's around for us all, that actually designing services for our communities in this day and age ought to be an easier process. It might have been, generations ago. But sad to say that isn't the case, and I think what would greatly enhance everyone's position, both the charities and the people who are receiving the service, the population in general, is if there was more thought and a better attempt at designing services that actually met the needs of the people that the service was intended for. Because what seems to happen repeatedly, and what's even more frequently now, is that services are provided, they are delivered, but it's only after the event that issues become apparent, and then charities who, as has been mentioned before, were probably initially there to add value to services being provided by the state, actually find themselves in the position of crisis intervention and fighting fires all the time, and that ability to have that additional piece of value, sort of falls into the background. So, for me, it's about, sort of perhaps having a bit of a fundamental rethink, although that's probably, an aspiration that is, too great for some people to sort of get a grip of, really.
Thanks, Barry. So I mean, clearly the enormity and the breadth of and the scope of the services that are delivered through the charity sector are significant. Miriam, if we were to identify or select one single issue, if we got that right, everything else would start falling into place. For you, what would that issue be?
You do like a
It's
good
an easy question to zero in.
Back to you after several days of consideration, because there's never one answer, really. I mean, I think all the things we're talking about today come back fundamentally to poverty and inequalities, because all these services are needed and all the support is required because of the level of poverty and inequalities in various parts of our region, and the disparity between people's life chances by postcode is well documented. And then there's the great differences between this region and other parts of the country. So I think that has to be at the back of our mind all the time. I do think one of the big changes that's going on in the NHS now is yet another reorganization, and one has to try not to be skeptical about yet more reorganizations, but the focus of it is correct. It's about focusing on place, which is where the essence of service delivery should be based, and it's about bringing together all the agencies in that place, local authority, police, children's services, etc., as well as the NHS, and trying to commission services in a sensible way that does the things that we've talked about, that Barry's talked about, as in, actually, wouldn't it be nice if the services focused on the individual's needs rather than where the boxes were or where the lines crossed? And I think that is a real struggle for very large organizations, but I think there is an aspiration to do it better. And to, as we said, involve the whole community. It needs to be involved in people's well-being and health. It's not just hospitals or other services. It's really about the well-being and people looking after themselves and ensuring that they early intervention. If you ask me for one thing, I would say poverty. How do we address that big issue? But early intervention, I would also say, and that's the trouble with lots of our statutory services, is that they are at the extreme end of need, and by the time you've got there, what people need is rather a lot, whereas the spending and focus on prevention and upstream activities so that people don't come to need the more acute services would be another thing.
Yes, thanks, Miriam. I mean, one of the mission of Citizens Advice Gateshead is about mobilising knowledge so the system works, and it works for everyone. And that's at an individual level in terms of delivering advice, but it's also at a system level, and the system isn't working for people. And I know as a charity, we spend a lot of time helping people to navigate the system to make it work for them. But obviously, there's a lot of failings. Wanted just to give you some feedback from one of our audience members has actually said that they think that the latter points are excellent, and sometimes they think that rather than asking charities to be more businesslike, they think it's time to ask public services to rethink and operate more flexibly and efficiently. I don't know whether you want to comment on that, Greta.
Yeah. Can I make another comment first? So, because I think it's really important when we're looking at systems and we're looking at co-producing systems, which, you know, these are some of the buzzwords at the moment. I think we have to look at it at a level of place, but we also have to look at it at a level of national funding coming to place to enable things to happen. So let me give you something that's a real bugbear of mine, all right? And I'll probably retire still waving this flag saying, let's sort this out. So let me give you an example of a real easy central systems fix that would actually prevent a lot of downstream kind of activity and traffic. So if you look at the current system for DWP of claiming universal credit, okay, you put your claim, we won't go into all about universal credit, I don't want to get into that discussion, but if you just look at it, they actually do an assessment and eligibility criteria check right then when you claim. For parents that are receiving credit, to get Healthy Start vouchers, you then have to fill in another form online to claim your Healthy Start vouchers. So a really easy systems fix for DWP that would save a lot of downstream would to actually have it, you have to opt out of Healthy Start vouchers because they've already done the eligibility check when you put in the claim for universal credit or child benefit, tax credit rather. So the system itself is duplicating itself. So my plea there for DWP would be all of the money you're saving from Department of Health and Social Care looking at Healthy Start vouchers, that would probably cover the cost of the additional uptake, which would improve the health and well-being of children, which would improve human capital and therefore drive the economy. And so it's a win-win for everybody at a national policy looking at a local policy. When we're looking at things locally, I think it's really important to include everybody in co-design. So what tends to happen a little bit at the moment is everybody's looking at co-production. And often I say it's co-production of knowledge rather than co-design of policy. And so we have a state at the moment, I'm seeing it across the whole country, where we're hearing the people's voice. Everyone's got a voice, and it's against this notion of universalism. Everybody has their own story to tell. I'm a great supporter of this because I think it's really important. The challenge then for charities or businesses or local government or policymakers is how you actually capture that voice in policy or service design. And so I hear this all the time, and for everybody that's had a problem doing it this way, there's somebody else that's had a problem that they found that easy, and there's a problem another way. So I see this, you know, when I look at applications for holiday activities and food in Gateshead, some people thought the online thing was easy, others struggled with it. Other things were around actually the online, getting to the holiday club is a challenge because the bus route there only allows one buggy on the bus. And so it's complex, right? People's lives are complex. And so I think that what I would urge from charities and businesses and local government is once you've listened to the voices of people in your community, it's actually your responsibility under the UN rights of the individual is to then actually take action on that. And what often happens at this point is you get either a charity, a business, or local government or national government interpret those voices and interpret how they're going to change the policy or the way of working. So I've been busy working on is how do you then take that next step of actually truly involving your citizens with equal power with those that are service providers at co-designing the solution. And that's where, to me, the real fun bit happens, because often the service user doesn't understand the constraints of the service provider, and the service provider doesn't often understand the implications of a policy change it would have on the service user. And so I think that we've come a long way, but I think that last part is the really crucial part to do. And I would say that across universities, NHS, government, charity, business, schools, the whole thing. So I hope that's clear. And actually also make sure that we've got everybody. And so, you know, we can look at that as children as young as 5. So you can go from 5 all the way up to 105 and include everybody's voice, but in a very structured way so that policymakers can actually take action on all of these voices.
To quote one of our audience, spot on. Thank you very much, Greta, for that. What I'd like to do is just lead with, sort of associated with that, but also taking the next question to Alison. Leslie Telford, who's with us today, has said she agrees with what Alison has said, has just referenced regarding rebidding of services. Not only is it not cost effective for charities to invest as much time doing this, it can lead to bidding wars. More importantly, it can lead to inconsistencies around service delivery when contracts frequently change between providers. Often those using services hold a great deal of stock in trust, and this can be eroded. Finally, it goes back to Alison's point around people being missed in the system when contracts are passed on due to focus on integration. Really comprehensive. Thank you very much for your contribution there, Leslie. This leads very nicely onto my next point, really, for Alison. To what extent is he or she who shouts loudest a feature in how full the charities' order books are? Is the biggest concern the amount of people seeking charitable advice, or the people who need it but aren't asking yet for it? And before I allow you to answer that question, we're going to ask the audience. So we have our second poll here. Should the biggest priority for us now be the people asking for help, or those not asking for it who need it? Should it be those seeking help, those who need help who aren't seeking it, or we don't know? Those who need help but aren't seeking it is in the lead at the moment. There's about half of you have voted. If all of you can finish your voting. Just another few seconds left. Very interesting results here for you to reflect on, Alison. The audience believes 65% of the audience think that the priority needs to be the people who need help but aren't asking for it. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, this is a really, really tricky one, isn't it? Because we have a waiting room full of people who have come to us who need our help right now. We've supported 15,000 people last year in our face-to-face service, more than 500,000 on our digital services in Gateshead alone. So that's really, really huge. And we are, of course, as a citizen's advice, we're a universal service, so we're free at the point of service delivery for anyone that needs us, regardless of their financial means or their capability to resolve their own problems. So for us as a citizen's advice, that's always going to be a tricky one. But actually, what we've recognised is that whether we like it or not, both consciously and unconsciously, there has been a shift in government and other public services directing people to our services. The money isn't following that, but it's certainly happening, and that's a real challenge for us. Now, if we truly believe in a fair society for all with lives well lived and the reduction of inequalities, we as a citizen's advice have to find a way to be able to meet our core service offer, but also we have to be really much more targeted in terms of where we deliver services. And Miriam spoke earlier about this drive to place, and locality services and providing advice in communities is going to be a really significant piece of our jigsaw moving forward. We're really going to be having to think really hard about how we do that, and we're working very closely with local government in terms of what locality working is going to look like in Gateshead. So the targeting of, if money is scarce, and it is scarce, then the targeting of that money and that resource to those that need it most, if our vision is to reduce inequality, has to be the priority.
Thank you, Alison. Miriam, Barry, do either of you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, well, I would just say, I think one of the things that really worries me at the moment is, this group of people who we know, desperately need help and support, but who just aren't being able to get effectively to the front of the queue. And I think what's not helping at the moment is, unfortunately, the consequences of what's come out of COVID, really, with services being under a lot more pressure than they used to be. And I think, I get a sense that there are people now who are moving around the system looking for solutions to problems because their normal first port of call isn't actually available to them. So, I wouldn't lay this at the door of any particular organisation, but if you, see what's happening in health at the moment, and the fact that people can't get access to GPs as readily as they perhaps were doing before the pandemic, and actually, they're moving around the system, trying to find, other ways of actually sort of dealing with their issues, whether it be mental health or whatever. And if you've got the capacity and the energy and the wherewithal to navigate your way around, then eventually you will presumably get to a point where somebody will have the time to listen and to try and help. But for those people who don't have those resources, who are, really sadly at the bottom of the pile, their desperation, one only imagines, just gets worse and worse. And it's a real concern, about how any charity, any service is going to reach out to those people effectively, other than when the crisis really gets to a desperate point that they show themselves either at A&E or on the street or whatever. It's a very worrying situation.
Yes, Miriam. Miriam, we seem to have an issue with your sound.
No, I muted myself, sorry.
Oh,
Told
good.
me.
I'm glad it was that.
No, I'm just about to repeat very much what Barry said. It's the old story. You can't be working on the upstream if your waiting room is full of people. You can't be going out looking for the people that should be in the waiting room that haven't either thought that they're entitled to anything or thought that they're not in trouble enough to ask for help, and then it becomes, as Barry describes, it end up in crisis, a crisis in health, a crisis in mental health, a crisis in their housing, or a crisis in their employment. The whole vicious circle, if you like. So, as I say, I think there needs to be a shift in the prevention and the upstream work, and almost the public health aspect in the emphasis of the work that people do. But that's always a very hard argument to have when there's waiting lists of for 2 years for basic hip replacements, knee replacements, etc., etc. So it is a terrible dilemma. But I think there's no votes in the long term. Do you know what I mean? Right. And that is sadly why many of our policies are driven by a 4-year cycle. Long-term health improvement, making a difference to things like obesity and diabetes, and the chronic illnesses and heart conditions, and even things like smoking. It takes 20 or 30 years of dedicated activity, and there's no kind of glamour in that, really. So we constantly have to think about the art of the possible.
Can I just come in there, Jane, please?
Yes.
You asked a question earlier on about what is the one thing that we would like to see to make a difference. And as the Chief Officer of Citizens Advice, you would expect me to say the re-establishment of free social welfare advice so that we can challenge the decisions that are important. But actually, if we think about societal problems as a whole, and that's what we're here to talk about today. We spend billions on societal challenges, things like mental health, addictions, criminality, and lifestyle challenges, or things like obesity and, you know, the diseases which are caused by smoking cessation. But we actually spend very, very little on the best start in life. So this is the period from conception up to year 2, where we know where many of the conditions that a child arrives in this world at and thrives in this world are set. So foundations are set very, very early on for the emotional and physical well-being of children. So if you know, recognizing that these building blocks of good emotional and physical health are laid down in this period, the case has to be made for further investment in start in life. We spend an awful lot of time talking about the problems that come later in life, but actually those building blocks are so very important.
Can I just add to that? One of the things I keep reminding myself
They're clamouring to respond to that, Alison. Sorry, Barry.
Yeah, but one of the things I keep reminding myself about as life goes on is, you know, way back in the 70s when I was at university training to be a probation officer, one of the theoretical concepts that was drilled into us was the importance of the right start in life, the building blocks that needed to be in place, so, you know, to enable people to live a life well lived and so forth. So, you know, it's not that evidence and that information has not been around. I mean, it's been clearly understood for generations. And, you know, picking up the point Miriam was making, you know, one of the biggest challenges, I think, is this stop-start of interventions and different programs and policies over the years. I mean, you only have to look back, you know, at one point we had short starts for young people and, you know, it seemed to be making quite good progress and then it stopped, and now there's maybe something like that needs to be introduced. What we really need is something that actually sort of you know, sees the process through from start to finish. But it's a long-term, you know, generational thing. And as Miriam quite rightly points out, you know, there's no votes in that. So you know, it's always, you know, going to be a challenge for that cycle to be broken. But unless it is broken, we're always going to be responding to one crisis or another.
Can I come in there, Jane?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So I'm going to say something quite controversial. So I'd say, Alison and Barry, you're partially right. Okay. So the first 1,000 days of life is fundamental in laying foundations. But actually, research evidence shows it's actually the first 8,000 days in life that's important. So brain development occurs until the age of 21. 21, our brains are still developing. I'm way down cognitive decline now. I mean, I won't remember that I've done this webinar in about half an hour, I'm sure. So that's where I am. But see, it's the first 8,000 days. And the reason politicians don't like saying that, people don't like saying it, is it's not quite as catchy as the first 1,000 days. But if you actually look at adolescent youth now that are often involved in criminal activity or have no jobs or have nowhere to go or are not in education and employment, those very same young people attended often Sure Start. And so I think that's a really good indication that I find it really annoying at some level. So I told you I'd be controversial, that we start categorizing people into the first 1,000 days, or these people at this age are really important. What we should be doing is we should be really rallying and saying to the government, just invest in people, period. It doesn't matter whether you're 85 or whether you're 2 months old or if you're 21. Investment in people is the biggest economic driver of any country. That's it.
I absolutely accept that, but the decimation of services has happened disproportionately. So, you know, young people have taken one hell of a hit during austerity. So many of their services have been discontinued, and that's not proportionate across all age brackets. So yes, I absolutely agree with everything that you say, but we also need to look at where those services have been cut, and some demographics have taken much bigger hits in terms of the eradication of their services than others. I mean, young
I couldn't
people
agree more. If you look at youth services, though, youth services are out of the first 1,000 days of life.
yeah. No, so I absolutely
That's one of
agree.
the hardest service hits. So all I'm saying is it's the first 8,000 days in life that are really important for the fundamentals, but we should be looking as a country of investing in people. I often laugh because I live in a poor community. I live in Blythe, in Northumberland, and you know, we're having new train station put in Blythe, and it's being sold as it actually will provide opportunities to work in Newcastle. Most of the people in Blythe work locally to Blythe. They don't go to Newcastle. And so we're having an infrastructure that will support people like me, but it won't actually support people that could really do with the help. That's all I'm saying, is that I think it's just really important to make sure we have this. The research shows it's 8,000 days, and that's research worldwide.
That's a
Thank you,
point.
Sorry, could I just add, you know, when you asked for the one thing, you know, and I was struggling to put it down to one thing, one of the things was also on my list was early intervention, and in my thoughts were things like Sure Start, because exactly as Alison described, you know, those. And you know, sorry, Greta, I know all of it's important, but I think if people don't have that early start in life and early schooling and early access to, you know, good healthcare and things like that, it, you know, the data is there. People won't catch up. They won't catch up. And even in mental health services, where you would think there would be a huge emphasis on young people, it's always been disproportionately poorly spent on, which is just, you know, again, in the face of all the evidence, because all the evidence says that if people are helped and there's interventions, you know, in teenage years up to, say, early 20s, people won't become permanent patients of the services. In general, people can, you know, really improve and develop with, as I said, you know, several times before, early intervention.
Thank you, Miriam. I'm going to have to, sorry.
I agree, but that's 8,000 days again. So teenage intervention, health intervention is 8,000 days.
Yeah.
I think this needs to spin out into a separate discussion, because it's clearly one that there's an awful lot more to say. And unfortunately, our panel, we only have a couple of minutes left. So basically, I just want to ask one very quick last question, and it's literally a one-sentence answer from each of you, please. If you know, charity sector is doing a huge amount, and lots of people, lots of organisations doing amazing work. Even COVID didn't get in the way of that. In fact, in many cases, quite the contrary. So let's imagine the charity and community and voluntary sector as a whole shut up shop tomorrow. What would happen? Do you think the charity sector would be filling a gap that others would step up to fill? And we'll discuss in the next webinar who that might be. So yes or no answer, probably, Barry. Would there be anyone else stepping up to fill that sector?
No, I don't think so. I think we'd have to reinvent ourselves.
Okay, Alison?
I'm not sure I can give a one-word answer to that, Jane. I mean, the reality is that, you know, we've just heard Prince Charles talk about the climate change problem that we've got, and the fact that even international governments can't do that without the support of business. I think that we would be reinventing ourselves in a way that, you know, had greater emphasis on partnership with business, greater emphasis on partnership with local government. But the idea that one sector alone can solve the societal issues that we've discussed today is simply impossible.
Thank you. Greta?
I'm just going to say I completely agree with what Alison's just said.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. And Miriam, final word?
Absolutely. I totally agree with what Alison said, but I guess my optimism would always lead me to believe that there'll always be good people who will step up and do something.
Yes.
No matter what.
Well, we've seen
Thank
that in
you.
COVID, haven't we? You know, the amount of mutual aid
Yes.
and community activism that's just emerged from what appeared to be nowhere has been astonishing.
Thank you so much to all of our panel. I'm so sorry we've run out of time. We literally are 1 minute to the end now. So if I just extend huge thanks to each of our panel members, and on behalf of the panel and the staff and volunteers at Citizens Advice Gateshead, thank you to the people who have joined us in our audience. I hope that you found it useful. Please leave any comments in the chat before you leave us if you wanted to give us any feedback, or send us an email through the email link that you have. Hopefully you can join us next week, the week after next, for our second webinar on the economics of social value, and that will be at 11:30, slightly later start time, on Wednesday the 17th of November. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you everybody. Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.